to come up to the stage, please? And how professional is this? Should have left this. Can't. It's for y'all. It's not for me. It's for y'all. Okay, thank you guys for coming. As we promised at the retreat that we would have more information coming out about SciENcv and ORCID. We just kind of gave you a little blast of information, and now is an opportunity to dive a little deeper, and hopefully you've had an opportunity to think about questions that you may have about SciENcv and ORCID. I want to introduce our panelists. We have Hillary Davis, the department head in collections and research strategies with the libraries. We have Jason Rinaldo, department head digital library incentives with the libraries. Pat Hayes, the director for research administration and engineering. He's our NSF guru. Now you're on the spot. And Missy Thomas, the director of research administration in CHAS. She is also our NSF guru. And Molly Puente, grants coordinator in research and innovation, and she is our NIH guru. So, with no further ado, I will let you get started and be thinking about those questions. Now's the time to ask.
Shall I kick us off? Sure. Right, so my name is Hillary Davis, and I come from the libraries with my colleague Jason, and I got two other colleagues right here, Danica, raise your hand, Danica Lewis, and Tisha Mentnek, also from the libraries. Those two have been dabbling around in SciENcv as well as all the rest of us. So I should say that I think we all agree that we're not experts at SciENcv. We are dabblers in SciENcv. This is that new biosketch format that NIH has created. So it's NIH's issues. And NSF has dictated that, let's see if this will work. No, it's on that one, but not, there it is on that one. NSF has dictated that as of January 2020, anyone applying for NSF grants should be using a special format, and so far the only one available is the SciENcv, which is oddly named. So this is the memo that came out in when? Anybody know? Does it say up there? Give it away. July, came out in July. And you can read more about it if you want to, and sort of try to figure out what in the world NSF is saying. But I think, would you all like to say anything else, or should we just dive into a demo?
Dive in.
Just go for it.
Dive in. All right, we've got a few. Okay, so does everybody see this SciENcv page? If you were to Google SciENcv, you would land on this page. Most likely it would be your top hit. And then you would click here to start button. And I believe that Molly, you've already logged in. So when you log in, maybe, you know what, I'm going to log in too, just so people can see that there are multiple ways to log in.
Sure.
You all will probably be asked by whoever, whatever researcher you might be helping, like, how do I log in? This doesn't make sense. So, because it doesn't. All right, so, oh, damn it. I'm going to sign you out.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Let's try this again. Yeah, if you have to, just put a cursor in front of it. Yeah. Okay. All right. So can y'all see that from where you are? If you need to come up, the people in the back can come up. All right. So do any of you work with researchers who are already applying for NIH funding? Probably do. Nodding heads, yeah. So those people might already be familiar with this, this weird system. But if they're not, if they've never applied for NIH funding, probably not going to be familiar with the system at all. So you can log in through this Google link. If a researcher is already familiar with NIH systems, they're going to use their NIH login or this thing called ERA Commons login. But here's this other little handy thing that you would never click on called See More Third-Party Sign-In Options.
When did you get to that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Let's not go too quickly. Whoops. Let's just do this. No, it's a good question. So if I Googled SciENcv,
Okay.
click there, then there's that blue button, and then I'm here.
Okay.
Got it? So this See More Third-Party Sign-In Options, I can click on Google, and I can log in using my NCSU email. I can also scroll down this long list and pick North Carolina State University. Click there. And you would normally have to authenticate in, but because the NIH system has stored all of Molly's cookies, then it automatically logs her straight in.
But that'd be shibboleth, normal shibboleth login.
Yeah, so like your Unity ID and your password, that's what would it ask you for. Which is great, because you don't have to, if you go that route, you don't have to create a whole new set of passwords and usernames and all that. So you get dropped into this thing called MyNCBI. So you're thinking, wait, I thought I logged into SciENcv, and now I'm in this thing called MyNCBI. What is this? And this is why this system is so confusing, right? But SciENcv is always tucked in, or typically tucked in down the right hand, the bottom. Can you all see that from where you're at? And because Molly's created a few test biosketches, she's got a few sitting in her SciENcv box. But if she didn't have anything there, it would show nothing to start with. She would click on Manage SciENcv. And then typically, if someone's new to this whole system, they won't have anything right here. They would click Create New Biosketch. And then you're here at this place where you got to make a few decisions. First of all, you always got to name it. So we'll do November 12th test, or you can call it whatever. Like I would imagine some researchers might put their name in there and a date or something like that. For creating NSF biosketches, you want to pick the right template or format. So if you're doing NSF, you want to pick the NSF format. If you're using NIH, you want to pick the NIH format, or IES. I don't know what that stands for, do you? It doesn't matter. Okay. And so another set of choices are you pick which data source you want your data to be pulled in from. You can either start with a blank document and hand enter everything, which is totally fine. You can use another biosketch if you've already created one at a previous time and you want to use that as your starting point. Or what Jason and I want to focus in on is pulling data in from ORCID. Who does not know what ORCID is? It's okay to be honest. So Jason will talk a little bit about what ORCID does and what it looks like. Imagine it's a unique ID for a researcher, and it helps get around problems like common names, like John Smith. So there might be a bunch of John Smiths doing research on mice. An ORCID ID will give them a unique identifier that they can use to distinguish themselves from other John Smiths. And there's a whole record associated with your ORCID ID, where you can include your educational history, your employment history, all the articles you've ever published or book chapters or whatever. So I'm guessing that a lot of NSF researchers may already have an ORCID record, and so they would want to pull their publications in from that ORCID record into this biosketch. So that's what we're going to do. The last decision here is you can make it public or private. I would recommend keeping it private while testing, creating biosketches. Click create. And so that little spinny thing at the top, it tells you it's pulling data in from ORCID. And this can take a little bit of time, so it can get a little frustrating, especially for researchers who have like 50 or more publications on their ORCID record. So let's see what we got. We got the name of the biosketch, which is what we put in November 12th test. It's confirming that we picked the format, the NSF biosketch format. It was updated today. It's private. Note that if someone wanted to download this and send it to NSF, the only options are PDF and XML at this point. I would hope that NIH would create a Word download version or at least a text file download version, but they haven't done that. So it's pulled in Molly's name and her ORCID ID and her education or professional preparation, as they call it, from these institutions. What it seems to be unable to do at this point is pull in her areas of study and her degrees. These are probably in your ORCID record, right? So this is a problem that NIH needs to troubleshoot, so you'd be aware of that. So she can edit these in the interface right here if she wants to. She can add other degrees here if she wants to. It's pulled in a few appointments. I don't know if these are all of your appointments that you expected it to pull in. And here's the part that Jason and I are focusing on. The rest of the panel can talk about the other components. It's going to be kind of a pain to hand enter all the relevant articles or publications in SciENcv. So if you've already got them in ORCID, you want to pull them all in, right? So ideally, click Citations, select Citations. Molly has worked with NIH before, so she's got a few things in NIH's native list of publications called My Bibliography, but let's pretend that doesn't exist. Click on ORCID, and what it's done is it's pulled in all the articles that she's already put in her ORCID record. And she can also click refresh if she wants to pull in anything that maybe she just put in her ORCID record 10 minutes ago. And what she does now is she picks the most relevant articles for that grant for which she's creating the biosketch. And she says save citations. Do they work? There they are. Took a little bit, so it's kind of a finicky system, but just want you to be aware of that. Anyone who's played around with it, you would have guessed that it's fairly finicky. So those are the things I wanted to show you, and again, to get it out of SciENcv, the download options are only PDF and XML. And I don't know who's going to use XML. PDF is your choice.
Once you selected those, is it editable in the system? Like it's not editable in the PDF. Did you figure out the way to edit it in SciENcv?
Do this. Right. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Does it work? Does it work? Yeah. So we tested that. I think we talked a little bit about this. We tried to download it in PDF because, say, some of the formatting of the citations or other components of the biosketch isn't quite right. You can't edit the PDF, which is kind of insane.
Can you edit it in SciENcv or your
You could edit the educational component and the appointments, but to edit the citations or the publications part, you would need to edit them in ORCID and click the refresh pull from ORCID thing, or you could go through this whole other route and hand input your citations in that My Bibliography, in NIH's native citation management thing. Other thoughts about that?
So just to make sure I'm understanding your question, so once you export it to PDF, you're still able to change anything in the SciENcv page. So if you want to fix typos or anything like that, you can do that. If you're thinking about trying to edit it for a whole nother grant, I would recommend actually creating a new biosketch from an existing biosketch so that you have two different versions, one from this grant, one for that grant, rather than typing over an existing biosketch. Since it's relatively easy to pull from an existing biosketch, it just creates a duplicate and then you can go in and edit whatever text fields have changed since the last time. And it will automatically put it on the newest form version when you do the create a new biosketch.
But it does appear as if the PDF itself cannot be
Right.
edited. So don't expect to be able to pull it out, fix it up in the PDF.
I know we're kind of focusing on NSF, but the NIH biosketch does have a Word
Right.
It does.
download,
Yeah.
which is weird.
Right.
Oh, question?
Is there a limit to how many products that you can put in to your biosketch? And do you get errors if you put in something that's not allowable in there?
Do y'all know, isn't there
so
some
I-
sort of limit to how many you can, it's like
Yeah.
5 or 6, right?
Yeah, so if you're, so I've played with it more on the NIH side of things, where you're limited to 5 citations per each contribution. And if you try to add a 6th, it'll make you uncheck one before you can check a new one. So it does limit it that way, and it does sort of implement the page limits. So it'll give you a warning that you need to edit things.
Talking about downloading into PDF and not being able to make changes, and I heard something about formatting. Is there a chance that when you put publications and citations into ORCID, you pull it into SciENcv, and then you want to print it, PDF, download it in PDF, is it going to change the formatting there? Is that what we're talking about? It could be incorrect formatting in your PDF that would then go with your proposal.
I was talking about like if they had a typo or something in the reference. Like that, like if there was a typo or something in the reference and you noticed after you had it in SciENcv, do you have to go back? Where do you have to fix it?
Okay, but do we have to be concerned with formatting in the PDF version that came from SciENcv? Will that document going to the sponsor be crystal clean?
So I would say preview it first to make sure, because one of the things that I've noticed when I tried to import some of my publications is that it kept adding extra commas in weird places. So it would be like the names, comma, 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 next name, comma, comma, comma. So you just had to like clean it up a little bit because it was just pulling things in a little bit oddly. It's not necessarily wrong, and I think if everybody's forced to do this on January, I think the reviewers are going to see a lot of biosketches that have interesting punctuation. So it's not going to like be non-compliant. It'll pass through all the compliance rules.
Okay.
It may just look weird in terms of like some of the punctuation and formatting, depending on how you pulled things in from ORCID or if you pulled things in from my bibliography.
Question.
Is there a way to access our faculty's CVs?
Do you want to give it a try?
So do we want to talk about the citation index thing now, or?
Do you want to do delegate access in
And
SciENcv?
delegate
I think you
access?
start there.
Yeah.
Delegate access,
Delegate
yeah.
access first.
All right.
Okay. Oh, do you want me
Who wants
to?
to
A quick answer, yes.
Yes.
And one decided.
We'll show you how.
I was going to say, start with delegate access. I know that's already pulled up.
Okay.
Who wants
You
to
wanna do it?
demonstrate that?
I guess since it's in my profile. Okay, so let's see if I can get back to where we're. Okay, how do I minimize this? I'm not used to a Mac. Okay, so for delegate access, so on my NCBI, right up at the top, there's this blue menu bar, and if you click on your email address, it'll bring your settings. And here you'll see where you can add a delegate. So the PI would have to add you, or the faculty would have to add you. It's relatively simple to add a delegate because all they ask for is your email address. So if one of you guys wants that, so I've already got Hillary in there, but if one of you guys want to.
Do you want me to enter my email
Sure.
address? So I don't have to like spell it out to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you enter the email address, it's going to send an email to that person saying, so-and-so is trying to add you as a delegate. Do you accept? And they have to confirm that they're willing to serve as your delegate.
I'm going to run back and be me again.
So in this case, it'll send, it says it's awaiting confirmation for Jason, but we already have Hillary as one of my delegates, so.
I got an email. I'm clicking on it now. And then I get this thing that asks me to confirm the connection or decline the connection. I'll confirm it. And let's see, maybe if you refresh the page.
Yep.
Whoa,
And
a
now,
live demo that worked that much.
so there's two things that you can delegate. One is the SciENcv, and the other is my bibliography. So my bibliography is what they use to pull in the PubMed citations into, like matching a PubMed citation to a researcher, right? And so if you are doing an NIH grant, go ahead and get the My Bibliography going, because for your RPPR, you're going to need that My Bibliography because that feeds into your compliance tests later. So definitely if you're doing NIH, if you're just doing NSF, the My Bibliography is not that critical because it's just PubMed. So then once somebody's a delegate, let me see if I can go back to, let's just go back to my NCBI. So here, okay, I have my own CVs, but then I was given delegate access to Hillary's. So if I click on delegated CV, that would give me, and it's spinning, that would give me access to edit any of Hillary's. So that's where you would go if any of the PIs gave you access, you'd see their name there. You click on that, here's all of their past biosketches, and you could go in there and edit them or create a new one for your proposal. Any questions about how that delegation works? Yeah.
Can we get delegated access for people not at NC State, faculty at other institutions?
I think so. I think it's mainly based on email delegation.
Cool, thanks.
I guess one of the other things to point out here is so Hillary's linked to her ORC ID. I've linked to my ORC ID. From your MyNCBI page, I think they have, I don't want to, do you want to talk a little bit about ORC IDs and how that helps? Because it helps for the PI to have already linked their MyNCBI account to their ORC ID and to their ERA Commons account if they have that My Bibliography going in. So if you want to talk a little bit about that.
I don't know what I would say.
In terms of
Particular piece.
do you want to show ORC ID? Sure. And what it looks like?
Okay. So I can show a little bit about work.
I mean, we've got, just so you can kind of see some of the upstream things. So ORC ID, which we've talked about, is this program that allows us to kind of consolidate everybody's profile into one place. Here's an example of what a profile can look like.
So, yeah, so this is Molly's here, and you've entered your own employment and education and qualifications. You can also add some other things. So let's say you've had a name change and you've published under, or you've published under other names. You can also add other names that you were known as. And and some keywords to describe you. If you really paid attention to where is it? SciENcv, there is the option in a biosketch to these synergistic activities. It will pull in some of your keywords into there. ORCID IDs are being linked on journal publisher pages. So this is one reason why your researchers might care about them. And so because they can go from that link to an author's name in a publication to their ORCID record, your researchers might want to also put in the websites that are associated with them as well, that have even more information that describe their work. So there's a space to add other websites. So basically, an ORCID ID is this number that uniquely identifies you. Sometimes it's put as a social security number for researchers. And so if you have a common name, if you are John Smith, I'm looking at a publication and I see the name John Smith, how am I going to know which of the John Smiths that I looked at? Even if I look up the institution, it still might not be enough for me to be able to find the right person. The ORCID ID allows a way that you can find someone more easily. And the connection here, why I'm really here, is that the way that these works got into Molly's ORCID record was from NC State University libraries. There are other ways to get works into ORCID. There are these AdWorks wizards. You can do search and link. Crossref metadata search is a good one to go to, especially if you're, the research is issued a DOI. Crossref is a service that issues DOI, so you can find works that way. And there are others like Researcher ID or Scopus. There's a PubMed one here, European PubMed Central, which includes all of US PubMed as well. So that's another source. So this is a way that folks can get works in. But one of the big challenges too, so it's nice that you're able to link your ORCID ID with your MyNCBI account and pull in information from your ORCID record into a biosketch without having to re-enter it. That's one of the big advantages of ORCID over some of these other like profile or identifier systems, is that it has a really high reuse value. And SciENcv is just one of those examples. So it's worth it for researchers to enter data into ORCID because it can be reused not just in their biosketches, but across other systems. So I mentioned journal systems. Increasingly, publishers are asking for an ORCID ID as well. There's also some local reuse that we're making of it. Some colleges and departments on their faculty directory pages have a list of publications that's served from the libraries. But one of the ways that we discover a lot of the citations is from someone's ORCID record once they've linked it to us. One of the big challenges, though, with ORCID is if you have a prolific researcher, they might have quite a backlog of publications that they would need to add. Even asking them to use one of the search and link wizards might be a bit much. So the libraries has offered a CV service. Basically, and I'll try to...
I think it's on the first tab that we've put it there.
Yeah. So all that a researcher would need to do to take advantage of our service to fill in that backlog of publications is come to this site, the Citation Index, and that's ci.lib.ncsu.edu. And they would just click on the Get Started button. And I'm not sure if I'll be able to demo this, but I'll give it a try. Okay, so Molly's already gone through this process and linked her ORCID ID with the libraries. But what happens is, and I can show a quick example of this. Here's what happens when you register. You click Get Started. There's this explanation of what ORCID is. You click on the big Create or Connect your ORCID ID. You're led to this page where you would authenticate with ORCID. If a researcher already has an ORCID ID, they can log in. If they don't, they can register for an ORCID right then. Just enter some very basic information, and they've got one. The recommendation is, while you can use your institutional account to log into ORCID, we recommend that people use their personal account. An ORCID ID is something that is the researchers. They carry it with them throughout their career. So we want to be able to make sure that they have access to their ORCID record regardless of if they change their institutional affiliation. Hopefully we also then begin to see people that are coming from other institutions to NC State that already have their ORCID ID as well. So recommend that if they're signing in or signing up, to use a personal account for that. It is possible, though, to link that to their institutional account. And then we ask for some authorization on someone's ORCID record. So we want to be able to add and update research activities. And what the libraries provides now is a way to update works there. So let me, once they go through that process, and it really takes just 5 minutes, I'm often brought into department meetings and give a short presentation about ORCID, and then can get folks signed up during that time. As long as people bring their laptops and know how to log into their ORCID record, it really takes nothing. And then we just ask that folks send us their CV. And so explain a little bit about what our CV service is, which is that what we commit to begin with is that kind of current awareness use case. We'll take someone's CV, we'll get it entered into our system, we'll deduplicate, we'll find DOIs for things. DOI, are people familiar with what a DOI is? No. A DOI is a similar identifier, but in this case it's for a work like a journal article. So a journal article can be given this URL called a DOI that allows you to click on that and then get to the article no matter where it happens to be published at that time. That is often the key to lots of other data about that work. And so you'll see on a lot of CVs, faculty are beginning to add DOIs to their CVs because it's some currency about the work, as well as, again, an easy way to get access to the work that isn't going to change when publisher pages change. So we find DOIs for publications. Even though a DOI is a relatively new invention, DOIs have been issued for things back through time, so there's even one of the first scholarly publications from the 1600s that has a DOI. So we fill that in. That allows us to get more information, so we can also then look up open access copies of works as well. But then, okay, what do? We've got CVs, we learn about new publications from a faculty member. Then we push those citations to ORCID for them. So they have allowed us, through that authorization process, to have access to their ORCID record. We push those citations with DOIs up to the ORCID record so they can be reused. So we're doing two-way syncing between our citation index system and ORCID. We're discovering new works from ORCID, and we're also, when we discover a new work, say from someone's CV, we're pushing that up to ORCID for them so that they can make better reuse of it. Yes? Sure, there's probably lots of questions.
First of all, I thought you said DUI, so I was
Oh.
a little concerned about that, and I realized it was DOI.
Sorry.
So the faculty member uploads their CV and then their auto updates. So are you getting that from the faculty? Where are you pulling in the new pubs?
Yeah, so new publications. So for about 12 years, the libraries has been harvesting publications that have an NC State University affiliation associated with them from Web of Science. Okay, so that's one way that we've found publications. So we already might, as soon as someone links their ORCID ID with their Unity ID and the citation index, we might already know about a lot of their publications that we can push to ORCID for them if they have a blank record. And then, so that's one way that we're constantly discovering new works. The other is when a researcher uses their ORCID ID when they publish. So increasingly publishers are asking for your ORCID ID, at least for the corresponding author. Once they do that, that ORCID ID is associated with that publication throughout the whole publication process. When it's published, when it's issued a DOI, metadata is pushed up to a service called Crossref. Crossref then pushes that data into ORCID for them automatically. So the researcher doesn't have to add that citation to ORCID as long as they use their ORCID ID when they publish. So in short, they use their ORCID ID when they publish, it gets into ORCID, and then it gets, if they linked with their Unity ID, it gets into our local system as well. Other questions? Sure.
I found it really helpful when I sent you my CV through this, and I know I have a very short list of publications. But if you have a faculty that's got, say, a CV that's 5 or 6 or 10 pages long, how long does it take the library to get the ORCID ID page all up and loaded so that that could then be used for a biosketch? How much time do we need to give you before we can actually start using that to do applications?
Yeah, so what we've been trying to target has been about 20 days. And that's for the kind of most recent 3 years. For many researchers, the reason why they're contacting us about this service is because of those faculty directory pages. They want the list that's being fed from the libraries to be current on those directory pages so that they can attract graduate students. So that's been the use case that we started with when we developed the service. Now, once we're talking more about reuse in SciENcv and with these funder requirements, I think we need to rethink the service some about how we can be more responsive to you all. What exactly that looks like, yet I don't know, and that's what I would ask for your help with, is what kind of service could we provide that would be useful for you, that would save you and your researchers time? Yeah, and what are reasonable expectations as far as time goes? So I don't have an answer so much for, I think, what your question is, but fair enough?
Right, so
Any
if you
follow-up
have
from
a
that? Yeah.
proposal that's due in, say, February, if your PIs are able to get their CVs over to the library, say, at the beginning of January, it's reasonable to expect it'll be on time for the biosketch. If it's February 1 and it's due on February 5th, then probably not, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, we probably can't help in that case. But There are other ways that ORCID could still be leveraged to make sure that the citations are correct in the biosketch. So SciENcv has that delegate access. If you wanted to do similar, ORCID has what they call trusted individuals. So you could become a trusted individual on another's ORCID record, and from that be able to use those search and link wizards to be able to look up citations and pull them into their ORCID record so that they can then be reused. Yeah, but if you do get to your researchers early enough and have them take that 5 minutes to link their ORCID ID, send us their CV, and you give us a heads up that you have a deadline, then we're happy to try to, help meet your deadlines there. We're also looking, while we've targeted that kind of recency use case, we're also looking at how to get some sense of how much a work has been cited as another way to find which works we need to prioritize, getting all the way through our process. So we're looking at how to become more efficient for the things that are going to be most impactful for that kind of reuse.
I know this would never happen, but just say, hypothetically, we find out on February 1 that our proposal's due on February 5th, and nothing is in place. What do we need to do? Like to get the appropriate biosketch for NIH or NSF? Would we then have to go into ORCID and set all that up and pull in from all the different, like ERA Commons and pull it in? No.
No, you could just go straight into SciENcv. It would be manual and create it for that one.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yep. That's going to be the quickest, easiest path.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a lot of us have an ORCID and have a SciENcv, and it's mostly complete.
Mm-hmm.
Will the CV services help us make sure that's correct and up to date and complete? Even when we start, it's sort of halfway.
Right. We'll make sure it's more complete. So what ends up happening is a researcher might have started using their ORCID ID when they publish. So they'll have like a smattering of things that are in their ORCID record.
And then gotten fed up.
But it doesn't go back to like even 5 years ago or previous. Between the publications that we already know about for them and ones that we can discover from their CV to like fill in gaps, we can make it more complete. In the end, for a lot of these processes, finally, it's the responsibility of the researcher if they really need something to be completely complete.
Sure.
But we can try to help save them time with that.
Right, and the other issue would be checking for duplicates.
Yeah.
If you're not careful in SciFinder Scholar, you'll get the same reference twice, different by a comma or two, if it comes from Chemical Abstract Service or from PubMed. And that gets messy later in the day, too.
Right, absolutely. So we end up, as part of the process, we do deduplicate. So I've got some student assistants that I work with who do a lot of this workflow. They review each other's work. There's a full-time staff person that does final review before something is saved. So we do have a workflow to help with the deduplication. Now, it becomes particularly challenging when researchers don't always cite their work on their own CV the way it is in the final publication. So they'll put on something, their CV that was like the title as submitted, and then that never gets updated when it's finally been published. And so those can be trickier ones for us to try to like reconcile and make sure that they're a match, but there's usually other hints in the citation that allow us to do that. We make best efforts to be able to, yeah.
So Right now, I can't make ORCID go into SciENcv. Did we find out if there is a file extension that we can upload?
So
Do we know?
we do know that there has been some progress made. So I don't know the last time that you tried to get publications into SciENcv via ORCID, but just in the past like week and a half, 2 weeks, there's been progress. So they've been working on it. So you may try again. The other thing that we've noticed is if a DOI is incorrect or improperly formatted, SciENcv will choke on that. So if it's not correct in ORCID, SciENcv won't be able to pull it in. And state your question again. You haven't been able to import things from ORCID into.
Is there a way to bypass ORCID if we need to upload like an extension file?
Oh, right. So that would be instead through my bibliography, right? Or is that correct?
That's one way you can bring in publications that's other than ORCID is going through my NCBI's bibliography format, which is the My Bibliography.
Which is just PubMed though.
I think you can manually add things to your bibliography that aren't necessarily in the PubMed thing. Like there's a little bit of a crosstalk there, but yeah.
We were thinking there was some kind of file extension.
So I wanted to make sure that yes, that is a source of data that can be used. But yeah, I think the uploads that they allow into my bibliography, one of them is RIS format for citations. I've got an initial version of a mapping from how our data is to that RIS format that we can try for importing into my bibliography that could kind of be, that workaround until SciENcv folks, or I don't know who exactly fixes that ORCID import piece to everyone's satisfaction.
So I think there'll be a little bit more pressure to get that right soon, because I don't know how many of you guys are managing training grants, but starting in January 2020, NIH is going to require all new trainees appointed in X-Train to have ORCID IDs as part of the appointment process. So all of your graduate students and postdocs are going to be creating their ORCID IDs, and they're going to ask that the ORCID profiles be used to start filling in some of that table information, which could be great, could be horrible. We'll see how it turns out. But I think NIH is going to be working a lot on trying to get better communication between ORCID and their systems, because they're moving towards making it a requirement for people moving forward.
Yeah, so while we focused on like the biosketch requirement, funders are increasingly requiring at least, that there be an ORCID ID associated with the application. And so you might not use ORCID as the source of data for any of this, but they're still asking you to have your ORCID ID listed. And what I wonder is how those are being used throughout the rest of the process. The part that I would like to help with is helping to make ORCID records more complete, so that if, say, it's a reviewer who sees that ORCID ID and clicks through it, they see something in the ORCID record. It's not just that the researcher signed up for an ORCID ID right before submitting the application and it's blank. Trying to help as another little way to make sure that those records are complete, so that when in different workflows, including funding workflows, there's something in those records. Yeah, so if I use the ERA commons, so I creating an NSF biosketch, external source ERA commons, do you have stuff in that account? We'll see.
We'll see, yeah.
So we're creating a
I
CV.
think I added my educational stuff there.
Yeah, so other stuff pulls in. Let's see if we select citations. So my bibliography is the other source that'll come into SciENcv. Is it correct? My understanding is that it's NIH researchers who are most familiar with my bibliography.
Right, because my bibliography does a compliance check on whether your publication meets that public access rules. So when you're doing RPPRs, you're supposed to use your my bibliography to automatically pull through. So if you've had an NIH grant, you want to have all of your publications in there because it makes writing your progress report a lot easier. The other trick or difference is when you're doing an NIH biosketch, it allows you to put a link to a full bibliography so that investigator can list all of their citations for their entire history as a hyperlink, as long as it's to a .gov URL. And pretty much right now, the only .gov URL that actually does a formatted bibliography is my bibliography. So, for example, you couldn't link to your ORCID bibliography on your NIH biosketch. You couldn't link to your Google Scholar bibliography. And a lot of PIs try to link to their Google Scholar bibliography, and then it's not a government URL, so it gets kicked out for compliance. So that's just pros and cons in terms of whether you want to put all of your publications in ORCID, all your publications in my bibliography, or have them in both places. Kind of depends on which agencies you're likely to do biosketches for. If you've got a PI that's likely to do both, it doesn't hurt to have them in both places, and they can kind of feed each other. So once you have it in one place, it's easy to move it to the other. So.
I'll just give one more plug for ORCID. Since you mentioned Google Scholar, faculty often say, oh, Google Scholar does a lot of this for me, why ORCID, or something else. And one of the big reasons is Google Scholar actively prevents you from being able to reuse the data unless you're the person who's like exporting. It's your own profile, unless it's your own profile. So the reuse value of a Google Scholar profile is relatively low compared to ORCID, which is being integrated into all of these publisher, funder, institutional workflows. So yeah, that's the real advantage of ORCID, is that reuse piece.
One question over here.
So if I understand the question correctly, it's about from the time something is published, how quickly are we able to discover it from various sources? Yeah, it really depends. So all of this depends upon whether the publisher is accurately and quickly enough pushing data into other services. So Crossref, with the creation of a DOI being one of those. Some publishers, they're showing up very quickly. Others, there's a lag. Others will see that they're showing up in Web of Science before they're showing up in Crossref. So it's really kind of like all over the place as far as like how quickly they'll show up. Now, one of this really isn't your question, but I think it might get to it. If I need this thing in my ORCID record now in order to be able to reuse it, I can enter it manually. And if usually when something's going to get a DOI, even if it's not public yet, I know what that DOI is as an author. So I can add that to my ORCID record. Now what's going to happen is, let's say I do get auto updates in my ORCID record. Those citations, going back to the duplication question, will collapse into one because they match on that DOI. And so even for some of the citations that the libraries has pushed up to people's ORCID records, not the source that shows up in ORCID because they collapse together on that ID. Okay, thumbs up.
So if we are having issues with SciENcv, who do we call? Is it like grants.gov and we call the upline? Do we call the libraries? Do we call you? Who do we call?
I think Hillary's going to pull up some helpful resources.
So whenever we've been working with these folks and a few testers to try to figure out how to correct some problems with SciENcv, the go-to has been, and I'll refer to this page in a second, but honestly, the people who can resolve problems with SciENcv is the NCBI help desk. That's just another element of NIH, so NIH help desk. I have been sending lots of tickets to this email address, and they send you back a case number, and that case number is something you can use to go back to them and say, where are we at? Why is this not resolved yet? And they have, I know we looked at the problem of things in ORCID not being pulled into SciENcv at all, and they have been making some progress, which is a good thing, because the deadline is coming up pretty quickly. So NIH is the best place, because we have nothing to do with the crappy SciENcv system. I would love for us to have more control over it so we could fix it, but it's just not ours, nor is ORCID ours. However, ORCID seems to have better development behind it, and so any issues that come up with ORCID can be resolved more quickly. And I think within the libraries, there are a few folks that can try to help troubleshoot around the edges, but really the work is going to be done by the NIH folks.
And Hillary's been really great about, as she finds issues, submitting them. I encourage everyone else that as you find issues, submit them, because the more that they find out about the issues now, the more likely they will be to be fixed by the time you're getting into that crunch time.
I think they're tired of hearing from me.
Some diversity.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll leave it.
So just to sum up, if we have a faculty member who has an ORCID ID because they just had to go out and get one, but they haven't populated anything, so they are starting from ground zero in terms of any of these systems. Their most efficient process would be then to link to Citation Index with their ORCID ID and Cite Help and send you a digital version of their CD.
You got it.
We would very much like people to do that, yeah.
So researchers just said, I understand I've got to create my ORCID ID. I'm creating an ORCID ID, but it's got nothing in it, starting from ground zero, as you said. What is the best way to get publications into ORCID so that I can then port them up into SciENcv to create my biosketch? The fastest thing to do, as long as there's multiple weeks of time, is to go to the library's Citation Index service, sign up for that, and it takes 5 seconds to use your Unity ID to say I'm signing up for a Citation Index. Then within that interface, there will be a, do you need help adding your citations? If so, use our CV service. Click that. Then I think there's a prompt to upload your CV, and it goes to Jason's team, and they'll work on it. And then y'all do a follow-up email to the requester, letting them know when everything's set up.
So the prompt that we have is once we've gotten the last 3 years of their work into Citation Index and whatever we have synced up, we then contact the researcher and say, this is what we've done so far, this is what we still have to do, and let us know if you have something that, there's a need for us to go into that backlog further more quickly. Because this funding use case is a relatively new one for us, and it hasn't been, what most folks have been thinking of as far as getting stuff into ORCID.
I'm trying to remember from when we met, one of the two had an option versus manual uploading of citations to import a file. And I'm thinking maybe now it was ORCID, not SciENcv. Like if you go to input a new reference, I think you had the choice of manual and maybe a couple other.
Yeah, so ORCID has a lot of different options for how to get works in. While you can upload in various formats, I think BibTeX is the main one. My recommendation is to instead use the search and link wizards, especially that Crossref one. Faculty will often enter their own citations without that really crucial DOI, which means that duplicates get created, and there are other issues that come from that as far as the data not being able to be updated when it gets corrected. While it's possible to enter things manually or upload a format like BibTeX, the search and link wizards are the best way. And there's a way to enter like an individual DOI that they've added recently, and what are some of the other options? I can't really read.
It looks like search and link, add archive ID, add DOI, add PubMed ID, and import BibTeX, that special formatted file, or add manually. Those are your choices.
And I'd probably go down that list as far as the order of preference for, if you can do it from a search and link wizard, that's going to be your best bet.
I was just thinking if it's a rush.
Yeah.
If it's a rush, I would just create it manually from my SciENcv. SciENcv, whatever it's called.
Yeah, yeah, I know, right?
So input it manually in SciENcv rather than import.
If it's a rush, yes.
You won't have a choice.
You just create,
Will SciENcv fill back?
probably not.
No, I don't think SciENcv writes back into ORCID for you.
So that's a good point. If you are in a rush and you go and you adjust, and you add something manually that's relatively new to SciENcv, then in order for it to pull in correctly the next time, you
Yeah.
have to go add it into ORCID manually or
Yeah.
however.
Yeah.
And maybe it's because of the live stream, but I see that some people from Panelists are currently signing up in the Citation Index.
I was going to say, for our live stream group, I might restate that if it is a rush and you had to manually import that into SciENcv, you will then have to do it into ORCID as well, so that you see it the next time that researcher is looking to use their work.
And this Citation Index linking, it's open to anyone with a Unity ID. So if it is something that you wanted to try yourself, even just to understand how it works, please feel free to do it to go through the process as well.
That's okay. Is there a way for the colleges or the departments to find out which of our faculty are already signed up for Citation Index? Is that something we're allowed to ask for information about or be able to find?
So that's all public, and I can so I'm going to, you can browse colleges here or authors. Working on adding search to this as well. So let me find, I'm just going to do chemical and biomedical engineering. Here you can see a list of works that are from, looks like someone has a 2020 article already listed. But you can see the people, and the list is prioritized by those who've already signed up with their ORCID ID. So that's one way that's public, that you can just get that list of people. Yeah.
Are there any questions, like, from the people live streaming? Do they have a way to submit questions? Okay. Okay.
Could we be reminded of the deadline?
So in terms of the NSF deadline, they actually haven't published a full deadline because it depends on when the new version of the PAPPG gets issued. I don't know if you guys have heard any updates on when we're expecting that or when that normally happens, but
January.
yeah.
It's usually January current year.
So they predicted January. We'll see.
I have a question for you all and for you all. What modes or how are you communicating these requirements, especially with the SciENcv one, to the researchers that you work with?
I'll answer quickly on behalf of the College of Engineering. I have spoken to our ADR about this, and what we're going to do for those of you in engineering, and I would probably recommend to all of you in the other colleges and departments. For NC State, as you know, we're decentralized into our departments, and then each of our colleges are decentralized, so we're kind of all over the place. So communication is going to be key, that our researchers are aware of these changes if they're not already. So for engineering, we're going to have a memo come out from our ADR and go to all our faculty. It will also go out to all the administrators that work in research administration. It'll have active links to the systems and all the information that have been presented here today. So I would encourage that to occur at the college level and department level. It serves multiple purposes. It gives the college a starting point because it's coming from the ADR down. It lets us disseminate information to the departments. So we all have a starting point to begin our conversations with our faculty and to begin our conversations with one another.
Hey, Pat, are you going to include, like, the link to ORCID, the links?
We're going to include all the links, yes. There'll be active links to SciENcv, ORCID, all the ones that we've talked here, as well as resources and tools and the tutorials and the YouTube videos. We're already working on that actually now.
Hey, can you share that with the other colleges?
I will be glad to.
So for Hillary and Jason, I'm sorry I missed the last Research Operations Council meeting, but have you actually spoken to the Associate Deans for Research that you know of? Had you been invited to a Research Operations Council meeting?
We have not. Our focus is really on getting those publications fed into SciENcv. I feel like the larger picture, the larger conversation is really part of the research administration community.
I've got a question.
I'll say that there was a larger presentation that the libraries gave to that group that did include some mention of the work around ORCID.
Have you guys found a lot of problems with uploading from ORCID into SciENcv?
I'd say yes, definitely. It's not been pleasant at all. It's been really a lot of back and forth with the NIH folks, letting them know what we're seeing. I don't think that they were aware of any of these problems before we started testing. So as Jason mentioned, the more testing that can be done prior to this becoming an active requirement, and the more people communicating with the help desk, the better.
Is there a problem? Is there one thing that you're noticing we do this incorrectly, or what? You know, if we did this, it would be easier, or it would go smoother? Is there any tips and tricks?
The only simple one that I've seen has been about the DOI piece.
Okay.
You know, citations with DOIs and the correct DOI. Also say that I was at a presentation recently where someone from NSF had mentioned that they had known about problems with SciENcv, but they'd been resolved. That was happening that talk was happening at the same time that, like, Hillary was experiencing continued problems, which just is another reason to, like, if you do encounter things, contact the help desk. We've also been in contact with folks at ORCID who communicate with government, and so they're in communication so they can try to work out. I don't think it's anything on ORCID's end, but my experience is that sometimes there's finger pointing in both ways when these sort of like API integration questions come up.
Not a question, but a thought. I just feel like NSF has left the door open for a transition period with other acceptable formats based on their wording. Have you heard anything about that? I mean, other than that wording, we've not heard anything else about other acceptable formats.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that so far, the language that we've seen is you must use an approved format. And to our knowledge, this is the only approved as of now.
Yeah,
Y'all hear something, let us know, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just being naive, I read it the same way as I think you were, which is like, oh, this is just an option, as long as it's the right
Yes.
format.
Yes.
But then talking with folks here, their reading was, there's particular, like, I don't know, legalese there. That means that, like, no, this is really the format.
If we hear anything, let us know.
And I think, from my understanding, SciENcv is the only option now, currently.
It's really weird that NSF is being so kind of quiet about that.
Because there's just a lot of uncertainty. They haven't even given us a date. It just says January 2020. Usually they're very specific to give us a starting date, and right now it still says January 2020. We're kind of all in this together, feeling our way, as Hillary mentioned. You know, it's kind of new to everybody at this table and out in the audience. So we're kind of just learning together, and that's what it's going to take, working us as a team together, and then as working with our faculty to make sure it happens.
From hearing NSF talk, the way they mentioned SciENcv and the new biosketch requirement was in the context of that transition from FastLane to research.gov. It's not my area of expertise, but it seemed related. They were making the relation between making that sort of transition over time as well.
And yeah, research.gov and FastLane, we're going to have FastLane for a couple more years. Probably. So it's a long transition then, because there's certain components, we're getting off topic a little, but certain components that research.gov can't accommodate yet. So if they're likening it to the same thing, we can expect, I think, a long transition. I will say that SciENcv, those of you that haven't went in and tinkered with it, played with it, I went in and just created a generic NSF and NIH, and it was fairly intuitive, the SciENcv portion. I didn't have any really bad hiccups. And I know some of you out there, Andrew, I think you've created one, and Missy, I know you played with it. So it is fairly intuitive, but I do encourage you to go out there and visit it and look at it and go in and out, become familiar with it, so when your faculty do come at you, it's not the first time you're going in there too.
So we were asked to create some sort of guidance, and this page is what Danica, Tisha, former colleague Rachel Posey created. And clicking on each of these crosses reveals lots of screenshots. So it's basically a screenshot walkthrough for logging into SciENcv, navigating that strange interface, getting down to the point where you're linking data from ORCID, using Citation Index if you need to flesh out your ORCID record, then filling out those pieces of the biosketch, going through, picking out the right format, that kind of thing, exporting. We've got a whole section on setting up delegate access right here, walking through all the things we talked about today, and then the most important piece, probably should move this up to the top, is like, what do you do when something's not working?
So I guess one other tip from playing around in the system is thinking about how you create a new biosketch and if you're creating it from an existing biosketch. So it'll allow you to start an NSF biosketch from an existing NIH biosketch and vice versa, but it kind of does a little bit of Mad Libs in terms of what it puts into different sections. So your education history is good, your professional history is good in terms of the jobs, but then when it gets into the NIH personal statement, it tries to make that the synergistic activity section of the NSF, which doesn't actually make sense, but it'll pull that information in. So if your PIs are just creating it and just trying to print it off and doing, you might notice that things aren't making sense in terms of the paragraph section. So kind of keep an eye out for that, because that was the thing that I was most intrigued in terms of how they created things. And they'll try to take your synergistic activities from NSF and plug that into your first contribution to science on the NIH format. So they try to crosswalk it, but it doesn't actually make sense in terms of how it plays out. So just kind of keep an eye out for that if you're seeing people trying to create it from across agencies.
And I'll just add one additional thing. There had been discussions from the panelists here that, because since we're all learning this together, we don't know what we don't know. So once we go live and we're forced to kind of use this come January, that maybe we'll have a follow-up Q&A, because once we actually are active participants, we may have more questions that we're not aware of. So it may be feasible to do an additional Q&A, say February or March, just as a follow-up once we go live with this.
The answers we gave today may make more sense.
Did not make my coffee decaf this morning, I don't think, so I'm in trouble. I just have one question I want to hear from everyone. So we've talked about the issues, the problems, this is what you need to look out for. Can you tell me what each of you have found to be the most beneficial thing that you've discovered in this process and going forward? I mean, it could be maybe there's a bug now, but once they get it worked out, it's going to be awesome. It's going to make our lives easier. So nothing. Now, I want to end on a positive note. What can you share that you think is going to be really positive for research administrators?
Well, the system's intuitive. You know, I think SciENcv, from our experience with it, it seems to be intuitive. It's not like you need a whole manual to maneuver through the system. Okay. So don't go into it with all the skepticism and fear that you're going to mess up. Just kind of go in there and you'll see.
Okay.
And you can create tons of test biosketches to really refine and sort of experiment with it, which you can leave all private. So any one of us, any of you can go in and log in right now, start creating test biosketches, and you're not messing up anything. I think one positive thing is it's encouraging to see the ORCID community, which is this global organization, working with federal funding agencies to try to leverage the data that is already in ORCID so that folks are not having to re-enter publications and other data more than one time. I think it's encouraging to see that. And when it's all integrating well, I think that'll be a big bonus.
Right. Anyone?
So
Molly?
I think one of the nice things is whenever you create a new biosketch, it automatically knows what is the most recent form set. So you don't have to worry about accidentally pulling an old form template, which I know some people have, you get your biosketch in and it turns out it's a form that expired in 2016 and you have to redo everything. With this, it automatically pulls in the most current form, so you don't have to worry about that kind of baseline compliance issues when you're creating new things. So that's really helpful.
So my hope is that this will encourage more adoption of ORCID, which beyond this has a lot of other reuse value, and this is just one other way that hopefully will help give a little more push towards that adoption.
Good. It sounds like we're going to have just a few little growing pains, but we're used to that. Every time we implement a new system, we go through this. So, but once we get, over the hump, I think it will make our lives, a whole lot easier. Anyone else? Last minute questions? I love Pat's idea of having a follow-up once we've all had a chance to get in there and play around a little bit, and so be on the lookout for that. I want to thank our panelists for sharing all their wisdom and knowledge. I want to thank Pat for offering to draft the communication out to all of our, that's a big one. That's a big one. Out to our faculty, and we'll have to think of some way of repaying that. So anyone else? I want to thank everyone for coming. This is very exciting information, and I think it is going to make our lives a whole lot easier. So if you have any questions once you get back to your desk, feel free to email me those, and I will get them to wherever they need to go. Thank you. Y'all have a great day.